The man who walked out like I was disposable came back months later acting like I was the one thing he could not live without. At first, that sounds like the kind of sentence people only say after years of therapy or after they have told the story so many times that the edges have gone dull. That was not how it felt while I was living it. While I was inside it, everything still looked ordinary enough that I kept trying to save the relationship from my own suspicions. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation smaller than betrayal, kinder than betrayal, easier to survive than betrayal. The truth did not care what I was ready for. When he left, he did not leave like a man torn apart by guilt. He left like someone stepping into a future he believed would finally make him happier than the life we had built together. That confidence is what hurt the most at first. There was no real hesitation, no visible grief, no sign that he understood the violence of what he was doing. He made our years together look easy to abandon, and for a while, I let that define how I saw myself. Hardest part to explain to people who have never lived through this kind of betrayal is how ordinary love makes you vulnerable in practical ways. You build habits around a person. You assume cooperation. You stop scanning every interaction for danger because commitment is supposed to reduce that burden, not increase it. That is why the early warning signs are so easy to miss. They arrive inside normal life, mixed in with shared meals, errands, bills, inside jokes, and routines that still look solid from a distance. By the time suspicion feels serious, your heart is already heavily invested in preserving a life that may no longer exist in the form you believed. What I did not understand then was how much trust can disguise danger when you are invested in continuity. In retrospect, the affair had been announcing itself long before he admitted anything. He was distant but energized, impatient but polished, irritated with me over small things, and suddenly fascinated by changes in his own appearance. The house felt emotionally colder even before he physically walked out of it. I kept trying to solve the wrong problem. I thought we were losing connection. I did not understand that he had already started investing elsewhere. I kept minimizing it because I wanted the relationship to remain something I could repair with patience rather than something I would have to survive by leaving. What made it worse was not just the event itself. It was the way each new detail forced older memories to change shape. Moments that once felt harmless became loaded. Conversations that once felt routine became suspicious in hindsight. That is one of the ugliest parts of infidelity and deception. It does not only injure the present, it reaches backward and contaminates the meaning of things you once held with trust. What nobody prepares you for is how much energy betrayal steals before the relationship even officially ends. You start rereading old moments, checking your own tone, wondering whether you missed something obvious or whether you were simply loyal in a world that rewards people who hide well. That internal spiral is exhausting because it turns your own memory into a witness you no longer fully trust. I lived inside that spiral longer than I should have, mostly because admitting the full truth would have required me to accept how much of my life was about to change. The official ending came one evening when he sat across from me with a rehearsed face and told me he needed to be honest. That phrase is almost funny now because the honesty was arriving only after weeks or months of deception had already done the real damage. He said he had feelings for someone else. Then he said he did not want to keep living a lie. What he meant was that he wanted permission to leave with his self-image intact. Once suspicion became evidence, I entered a phase I still do not remember fondly. It was part investigation, part emotional free fall. I was checking devices, dates, receipts, and timelines while also trying to function like a normal adult. Every confirmation hurt, yet every confirmation also made me calmer in one specific way. I was no longer crazy. I was no longer misreading tension. The story was real, and because it was real, I could finally stop wasting energy trying to explain away what my instincts had been flagging for far too long. There is always a physical moment when the body understands before the mind does. My stomach dropped, my breathing changed, and the room seemed to narrow around whatever proof I was holding. Once he moved out, the truth kept widening. Mutual friends filled in what they thought I already knew. He had been seen with her before he ever confessed. Trips I thought were work-related had not been work at all. There were overlapping weekends, private dinners, and one humiliating realization after another as I understood how much of my pain had been prepared in advance while I was still trying to save a relationship he had already downgraded in his mind. From that point on, I was no longer trying to decide whether something was wrong. I was trying to measure how long I had been living beside it without fully naming it. The scale of the truth matters because it changes the emotional category of what happened. The first months after he left were brutal because I had to survive two things at once: abandonment and comparison. It is not only that the person you loved chose someone else. It is that they often act as if the choice proves something about your worth. You begin replaying your body, your voice, your age, your patience, your mistakes, wondering which part of you became replaceable. That kind of grief can rot a person from the inside if they are not careful. Once I understood that, I stopped asking whether the damage could be explained softly. I started asking whether I could respect myself if I kept staying inside a story that required me to deny what was already obvious. Even before I made any final decision, something in me had already started separating clarity from comfort. Comfort would have meant delaying the inevitable, softening language, and pretending confusion was still possible. Clarity meant naming what was in front of me without dressing it up. That shift hurt, but it also gave me back a level of internal steadiness I had been losing for a long time. Eventually there is always a confrontation, whether you want one or not, but then something shifted. Life with her did not become the fantasy he had sold himself. Months later he showed up at my door looking older, thinner, humbled, and suddenly full of words he had been too proud to say when I was the one begging him to be honest. He said he had made the worst mistake of his life. He said she was not who he thought she was. He said losing me made him understand what love really meant. It was almost impressive how much clarity arrived only after his illusion collapsed. In that conversation, I learned something I have seen repeated in almost every betrayal story since. When someone has been lying for long enough, exposure does not automatically produce honesty. Often it only produces a faster, more desperate form of strategy. I also learned that closure is rarely given cleanly by the person who caused the damage. More often, closure is assembled privately from facts, behavior, silence, and the eventual realization that you no longer need a better apology in order to make a better decision. That realization was painful because it forced me to stop waiting for the other person to become morally elegant after months of choosing something much uglier. After the confrontation, the aftermath begins, and the aftermath is rarely cinematic. It is practical, repetitive, humiliating, and emotionally expensive. Listening to him was surreal because I could hear the truth underneath his desperation. He was not only mourning me, he was mourning the version of himself who believed he could blow up one woman's life and walk straight into a better one without consequences. That fantasy had died, and now he wanted to use my history with him as shelter from the weather he had created. In earlier months, I might have called that romance. By then, I called it opportunism wearing regret. That stage taught me more about character than the actual discovery did, because it showed me who I was becoming under pressure and who the other person remained when the lies were no longer working. There is also a social cost to betrayal that people underestimate. You start thinking about who knew what, who suspected what, and who watched the relationship deteriorate without saying a word. Even when no one intended to humiliate you, the mere possibility that other people noticed pieces of the truth before you did can feel like a second wound. It is not pure ego. It is the pain of realizing your private devastation may have had an audience long before you had language for it yourself. And then comes the part no one glamorizes: the paperwork, the practical decisions, the humiliating phone calls, the explanations you owe people who were never in the room when your life actually broke. Meals still have to be made. Bills still have to be paid. Work still expects your attention. Meanwhile, your mind is replaying scenes it cannot fix. That contrast between ordinary responsibility and extraordinary pain is one of the loneliest parts of the whole process. In the end, my decision was less dramatic than people imagine and more important than any single argument. I did not scream. I did not humiliate him. I did not need to. I simply refused to become his safe landing after he had treated me like a stage he could walk off whenever a brighter light appeared. Saying no was one of the most important moments of my life because it proved I had finally stopped measuring love by how much pain I was willing to absorb. I chose myself, quietly and completely. That decision did not erase grief. It simply gave grief a direction. Instead of circling endlessly around the betrayal, I began moving away from it, step by difficult step. Recovery did not begin with peace. It began with routine. I had to rebuild trust in small, unglamorous ways, by keeping promises to myself, by protecting my sleep, by speaking honestly to the people who had earned access to my life, and by refusing to keep confusing suffering with loyalty. That process was slower than I wanted and less dramatic than movies teach us to expect. But it was real, and reality mattered more to me now than performance ever could. A major part of recovery had nothing to do with the other person and everything to do with identity. I had to figure out who I was when I was no longer organizing my choices around managing their moods, their lies, or the fallout from their decisions. That sounds abstract until you live it. Then it becomes very practical. Different mornings, different habits, different spending, different boundaries, different standards for what gets access to your time. The rebuild was not only emotional, it was structural, and that structural change is what made the healing last instead of feeling temporary. When he left me for another woman, I thought the story was about rejection. In the end, it became a story about recovery. His return did not restore my value. It revealed that my value had been there all along, even while I was too heartbroken to feel it. The begging mattered only because it confirmed what I had already started learning. A person who abandons you for fantasy does not deserve access to you once reality teaches them the cost. I do not tell this story because I enjoy revisiting it. I tell it because there are people still living inside the version of confusion I once called normal. If you are one of them, I hope you understand this. Clarity may arrive quietly, but once it arrives, it asks something of you. It asks whether you will keep protecting a lie because you are afraid of what truth will cost, or whether you will accept the cost and finally keep your own dignity intact. That choice is brutal. It is also where a real life starts again, and that is the part I wish more people understood. Betrayal is dramatic in the discovery, but its real meaning is revealed in what you do next. Do you go back to sleep emotionally because the truth is expensive? Or do you let that truth reorganize your life around something cleaner? That question changed everything for me. If you have lived through something similar, then you already know the answer is never simple. But it is still